We're back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The war in Ukraine goes on and on and on. And it seems as if very few of us actually are getting the full story of what's going on there, where it's headed, what the strategic goal is here on the side of the countries supporting Ukraine, including most prominently our own. Here to discuss that topic with us now is our friend Medea Benjamin. Medea is the co-founder of the peace group Code Pink, and she is the author of several books, the latest of which is a book on Ukraine and the conflict there. So, first of all, Medea, welcome back to the program.
Hey, great being on with you. Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you. And it feels as if one of the reasons why I reached out to you, as I mentioned, was that it seems to me that not only is there no sort of organized progressive resistance to not just what we're doing in Ukraine, not only aren't there any like coherent, well-structured, and by left, I mean, or progressive, I mean establishment left, establishment progressive, questions being asked. It seems that the only people in Congress, for example, who are promising to ask pointed questions about our expenditures there and our involvement there are the Republicans, and I fear they can't be taken in good faith. So it seems as if nobody's questioning what's going on. The news has been, you know, we hear of this bombing or this attack or the taking of this town or whatever, but it seems as if the entire narrative is kind of disappeared into a fog while billions of dollars keep getting poured into this conflict, while nobody with any real power is seriously talking about negotiation, and while people continue to die. I don't even think we get reasonable estimates of the fatalities that have occurred there. So one of the main reason I wanted to talk to you, I guess, was just to kind of see if you can help me get reoriented as to where this war is and what should we be doing about it and how should we be thinking about it. Well, what's your reaction to all of that?
Well, I would add to what you just said, it's also while we are moving closer and closer to a direct war with Russia, while we are moving closer and closer to a World War III and a possible nuclear war. So it is quite remarkable that as the U.S. just plunges deeper and deeper into this conflict, there is so little, if no, discussion at this in the Congress. As you said, it's the Republicans who have been questioning, but let's be clear, that's probably because it's a Democrat in the White House.
Right.
If the tables were turned, I think maybe our progressive friends in Congress would be joining us in questioning this war. But as it stands now, we have the entire Progressive Caucus being silent except for one person, Ro Khanna. He was one of the 30 members of the Progressive Caucus that signed that letter back in October calling for negotiations that was withdrawn in 24 hours. And he's the only one that has stood by the letter and say, of course, it's rational. We should have negotiations. Everybody else has been either retracting their signature saying, oh, I don't know why I signed this thing. I signed it when I thought maybe Ukraine couldn't win, but now I see that they are winning. So why should we negotiate when we can have victory? Or they've just been silent about it. And I've gone with my book to all 30 members of the caucus that have signed that letter originally to say to them, you were right when you signed that letter. You were right to call for negotiations. Please go back to that original thought. And I've had a chance to talk to a couple of people in Congress. And what I've been finding is that it's pretty much their objection was about the timing because it came out so close to the election, but not really the content. Yet they're afraid to stick their necks out. Somebody's got to start it. Somebody's got to give them a vehicle for sticking their necks out. And right now that doesn't exist. So we are stuck. And yes, there are Republicans who are going to be calling for hearings on some of these issues. Marjorie Taylor Greene herself has called for an audit to see where all this money is going. But we do need people from the Democratic Party to step out and to recognize that as we're moving more and more weapons and more dangerous weapons, and now with these tanks, well, the next thing will be fighter jets. And, where is it going from there? There has to be a real examination coming from both parties. This is too important an issue to be a partisan issue.
And Medea, or the number one objection I get from from my friends on the left. I'm sorry, I sound like Obama giving a State of the Union. They're my friends on the left. But the number one objection I get is, and I get emotionally where they're coming from, is, well, but don't we want to support the Ukrainian people in their yearning to be free and to repel an invader? And, no, I may try to bring up the history, the ways this has been avoided, the fact that, they're not going to militarily defeat the whole of Russia. So, but it, ultimately, the emotional response I get is, if you're a progressive, you support the freedoms of people to decide their own destinies, and therefore we must support the Ukrainians and give them what they're asking for. What's your response when you get that?
If you're a progressive, you want to end killing, suffering, the plight of refugees. You want to see an end to war. And you mentioned, well, there's no military victory. I think that's what we have to really be emphasizing. More and more people in military positions. Most recently, there was an interview with a brigadier general that was the main advisor to Angela Merkel in Germany, saying the same thing that Mark Milley had said, which is there's no military solution. And so I think we have to keep emphasizing that and saying, if you really want to save more lives and stop this suffering, it's got to go to the peace table. And should that happen a year from now, 2 years from now, or should it happen in the next 2 weeks or the next month? And I think we need to just be educating people also about this slippery slope. I know when we talk about nuclear war, they say, well, you don't want to reward Russia for having nuclear weapons. And they also say that Putin is such a madman, but he's not going to use nuclear weapons. They have actually said if the battle goes to Crimea and there is a chance that they would lose Crimea, there is a very good chance they would use nuclear weapons. Even that German brigadier general that I talked about, he said it as a fact. And that should scare the daylights out of anyone. There was just the doomsday clock that the atomic scientists just put out of saying we're 90 seconds to midnight. That should scare the daylights out of anyone. And I think, just to answer your question, Richard, start out by saying we come from the same position that we want to save the lives of the Ukrainians, but more war is not the answer.
Yeah, and there are, forgive me for this, but there are a couple pieces I've meant to write and haven't about this, and maybe I will yet, or maybe this conversation, you'll be able to add on them and make them more useful. But one is this, a story that came and went in the New York Times said that, some people are saying, well, the real goal is to overthrow Putin. Well, a story that came and went just one day in the New York Times was that the reason why there hadn't been more aggressive bombings of Ukrainian civilians was because Putin's generals very much wanted to be more, aggressive, wanted to cause even more, considerably more civilian death in Ukraine, but Putin wouldn't allow it. That story kind of came and went. It's like, well, wait a minute. When you're wishing for the, and I hate Putin, but if you're gonna, he's not my kind of person. But if you're gonna hope for the overthrow of somebody, you better be sure what's going to replace them is not a lot worse. And I would think a military coup or any other conceivable change of government in Russia with its nuclear weapons is a terrifying prospect, number one. And number two is, you mentioned the threat of nuclear escalation. The answer I get a lot of times is, well, it's probably, it's unlikely. It's like, probably not going to happen. And to me, first of all, I don't think, I don't have a intelligence to know the probabilities, but it's an old axiom from when I was doing, underwriting actuarial work as a young person, that if the risk is relatively low, but the loss would be catastrophic, it's a huge deal. It's like, you don't want to hear an airplane pilot say, I'm going to land this plane. It's got some problems. It'll probably be okay. There are just some things you don't want to hear. And it seems to me as if people are not viscerally taking in the risk that a massive nuclear conflict might bring, and tactical nuclear weapons can easily escalate into a major conflict. Nobody disagrees about that. I'm sorry to have gone on so long, but what are your thoughts about that?
There was a member of the German Bundestag that was on a show yesterday who talked about, well, it's easy for the United States because you're thousands of miles away and this conflict doesn't take place near your soil and so has less effect on your population. But we are right in the heart of Europe, and any wider conflict is definitely going to affect us. And if there is any possibility of a nuclear war, it is way too much for us to contemplate. And I think that people should be recognizing that as NATO gets more and more deeply involved, what is the key that Russia has in its back pocket? It's a nuclear weapon, and they are not going to leave Crimea. There was a piece yesterday in the Washington Post. I guess David Ignatius had an interview with Anthony Blinken, and he says, well, we recognize that Russia is not going to leave Crimea, and that putting in all of these weapons is not just to scare Russia, but to have Ukraine in a position to maintain its own security after this war is over. I think that's a very interesting position, but a very dangerous one, because, as the U.S. Gets more and more involved and more willing to support Ukraine in attacks on Crimea, that is the breaking point for Russia. And then you brought up the issue of regime change. Yes, I think it should be extremely worrisome for people who is a possible successor to Putin in this time of war. And it could very well be those people that you talked about who would like this to be a much more brutal war, because Russia certainly has the power to do that. And that's why I think what you hear more from U.S. officials is about weakening Russia. And in that sense, we've also got to look at the broader issue of the U.S. adversarial relationship with China, and both U.S. military and NATO saying that China is our main adversary, even in the midst of this war. And so weakening Russia is part of a larger plan to make Russia less of a viable ally for China. All of these kinds of calculations are just putting us on this path where the best possible scenario is an endless war. The best possible scenario is a war that drags on and on in Europe while people in the United States start to forget about this. But there are certainly a lot, and that scenario itself is horrific for the people of Ukraine. But the ones where this becomes a wider war, and now with Germany giving its tanks and allowing the other countries in Europe to supply tanks, it certainly is much more possible that there will be a Russian attack, maybe by mistake, on a NATO country, which will invoke Article 5 and will pose a real dilemma, because as Blinken has said, Biden is doing everything not to involve the U.S. directly in this war, but an attack on a NATO nation would make it impossible for Biden to keep the U.S. out directly. And that's where we're headed.
And this all, first of all, as far as Putin is concerned, it seems to be predicated on two competing narratives. One, that Putin is a madman, and two, that he is so rational that he would not escalate in a dangerous way, for example, using nuclear weapons. But that's just one of the many contradictions I seem to, perceive in this entire debate. Another has to do with the disputed regions. You've written about Ukraine, so you know this well. I'm all for supporting people's right to self-determination in principle. And if Ukrainians want to remain Ukrainians, they have every right to do so. I wholeheartedly support that. On the other hand, if the people, if they were to hold referendums in the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, bearing in mind Ukraine as a separate country is a relatively recent thing, don't those people have a right to self-determination too? So, but whenever I bring that up, it goes back to, well, we can't reward Russia for bad behavior. So I'm wondering if there's a way out of that circular debate.
Well, I think it is very important to bring up those regions when we talk about self-determination. And now we see with the recent interviews that Angela Merkel from Germany has given, as well as Francois Hollande from France, who were in power at the time when the Minsk Accords were signed in 2015, that effort by the Russians and the Ukrainians and the international community to put an end to the conflict in the Donbass and give the people in the Donbass the right to self-determination was really a ruse just to buy time and build up the army in Ukraine and weaponize them so they would be able to take back the Donbass by force. So there's great reason for the Russians to mistrust any kind of peace agreements with the West, because they have been violated as well.
So, and while we're talking about peace agreements of various kinds, this may not be a fair question to ask because you're not a mind reader, but you have studied the region, the politics, the history. I've been watching the trajectory of Volodymyr Zelensky with great interest over the past year and before. When Zelensky, as I recall, was elected essentially on a peace platform, that he was going to, after we interfered and that resulted in a government overthrow and there's turbulence, Zelensky basically, as I recall, was elected on a platform of negotiating a peaceful resolution with Russia that might even include some territorial concessions, whatever. Then when Russia invaded Ukraine, I distinctly recall, because I clipped it and wrote about it, Zelensky saying, I have two requests of the United States: weapons and support in negotiations. And I would think American support in negotiations is critical because we're the ones affecting the Russians most economically with our sanctions. But somewhere along the line, the request for negotiations disappeared, and in some ways more weapons aren't enough. I know at one point there was talk of a tentative deal for a ceasefire, and that Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the UK, went and supposedly told Zelensky, you can't do that. But I'm curious to see the change in Zelensky's posture from negotiator to weapons plus negotiation to just weapons. Do you have any insights into that?
Well, I think that's the momentum that war has, which is there was, as you said, a real possibility of finding a solution a month into the invasion. That was torpedoed by the West, particularly the UK and the US. And there was a promise that we will be with you until victory. And so that was a momentum for Zelensky to stop any negotiations and to go on with the war. And now the pouring in of constant weapons is another incentive to do that and a disincentive to peace talks. And when you're in the midst of the war and your people are being killed and there is tremendous hatred and rancor that is built up, it is hard to think about negotiations. But we must recognize that if the U.S. were to stop the blank check, they would definitely be sitting down at the peace table because there would be a necessity to do that. So I wonder, how long are the American people going to be willing to give this enormous amount of money to this conflict in Ukraine, over $100 billion in less than a year? And going back to this issue of Republicans who have now come into power in the House and are questioning this blank check. And then we have to look at the Europeans, both Biden and Olaf Scholz, when they made the announcement about giving the tanks, said, we are so unified in the West in this struggle. And yet you are seeing opinion polls in places like Germany that show a growing opposition to supporting an endless war. And you see people coming out in the streets in East Germany, in the Czech Republic, in Italy, in France, and a growing grassroots opposition to a war that has led to tremendous increase in inflation in Europe, the price of energy, the price of food. And then you have the global South, where there is a growing call to say, do something about this. This is affecting our people. So I'm hoping that there will be more and more momentum from places around the world that will put pressure on both Putin and Zelensky, as well as the United States, because I think we have to look at this as a war that's an internal one where Ukraine and Russia have to sit down at the table, but also the geopolitical war where the US and Russia have to sit down. And there are many things that can and should be negotiated between the US and Russia.
Medea, Benjamin, you mentioned victory. And that to me is one of the very elusive words in this discussion. The definition of victory in this case, victory might mean a return to the borders as they existed before February of 2022 when Russia invaded. But I've also heard talk that victory involves retaking Crimea or I've heard Americans say victory is the overthrow of Putin, as we've discussed earlier. So when our government says we're with you until victory, nobody's really spelling out. It's like so many American military engagements, it seems to me, where victory is never defined. Therefore, endless war becomes a real possibility. What is victory here?
Absolutely. But it's interesting, Richard, that more recently, you see people like Blinken and others talking about going back to the borders before this invasion on February 24th, rather than what they had earlier talked about of going back to the borders at 2014, which would mean taking back all of Donbass and Crimea. I think from the position of Zelensky, he has maintained publicly that it's taking back everything, including Crimea. But that is such an unrealistic proposition. And of course, on the Russian side, they say victory is the recognition of these 4 regions that they have had these sham referendums saying that they now belong to Russia. To me, these are negotiating positions.
Right.
And that they all mean that there would be some kind of compromise. But that would be up to both parties at the table. The question is how to get them to the table. And if we haven't done our job in the United States, putting pressure on Congress to put pressure on Biden, then we are postponing the day when those kinds of very intense and important discussions take place.
So that's a great point. And I can't resist bringing up, Medea, since you mentioned tanks. Another thing that struck me in following all of this was we pressured Germany. Germany was resisting for a while and give the Ukrainians some of their Leopard tanks. And Germany was saying, well, why don't you give them some tanks? And our military's response was, oh, you mean the M1 Abrams tank? Essentially, it's not any good. It's a powerful weapon, but you need this long, complicated supply chain. It wouldn't survive in the conditions they're experiencing in Ukraine right now, to which my answer was, oh, you mean war? So we've spent however many billions of dollars developing a tank that we can't even give away, literally because it's a piece of crap. And so we have to pressure the Germans to send their tanks that actually work. And then the final deal is, okay, the Germans will give their tanks, but we'll give some of our crappy tanks too. But we're going to pay General Dynamics, which manufactures those lousy tanks, to make a bunch more than that we could send to the Ukrainians, which is, it's going to take them 6 months to figure out. So they need the tanks that work from Germany in the meantime so they can get in them and use them. And it seems to me this is the vaunted military technology of the United States of America. I just couldn't resist. I mean, this has been driving me crazy.
Well, that's right. And they also have jet engines and get 3 miles to a gallon. And so there's got to be a lot more refueling trucks that go in to be able to refuel these tanks. And they talk about the high level of maintenance for each of them and how long it takes to train people on these. So, yes, it's hard to see why the U.S. taxpayer pays for these kinds of weapons that are not useful in the combat that they're supposed to be useful for. Unfortunately, these kinds of arguments get swept aside when it's really about the politics of the whole thing. And the German MP that I made reference to said that they were getting tremendous pressure in Germany from the United States to get deeper and deeper into this. The initial invasion by Russia led Germany to announce that it was going to spend $100 billion more on weapons. This is all part of the push that we heard a lot more from Trump when he was in power, saying, we've got to get these countries in Europe to just spend more on their military. And while a number of these weapons are made in Europe, a lot of them are made in the United States, and a lot of the European increase in money for the military is going directly into the pockets of the 5 big weapons manufacturers here in the United States. So they are gaining tremendous amounts of profits from this war, as are the U.S. dirty oil companies that are scrambling and have done quite a job replacing Russian energy that's been sanctioned.
I'm thinking of the cash register sound in that song "Paper Airplanes," but look, and I certainly can't think the Republicans will do anything different. I mean, they're already threatening, as we speak, to use the debt ceiling to cut Social Security and Medicare, but not the military. I mean, our insanely bloated military budget for this year also includes, I believe, pre-funding for certain military contractors to keep making replacement vehicles to create infrastructure, I believe is the term they use, that they don't even have to bid out for. And I believe that one of the beneficiaries of that is General Dynamics, the maker of the vaunted M1 Abrams tank. So I guess before we close, Medea, I do want to talk a little bit about our brothers and sisters and other siblings on the left a little bit, because it seems to me that, well, the anthropologist David Graeber, who was on the show a few times, he wrote that Abbie Hoffman's biggest legacy was that he convinced the American military establishment to fight wars with machinery and other populations and not with young people from the United States. That was really Abbie's victory over, and obviously he meant it ironically, but it seems to me there are other great victory, and in a dark way, I mean, hats off to them, is that they've entirely co-opted the left, the broadly speaking, liberalism, Democratic Party liberalism, not everyone, but a vast number of them, into the most militaristic positions. We should use media, social media and digital media to censor voices we don't like. We should feel free to invade and destroy countries we don't like. We should beef up our military. There's no better authority on threats to our country than generals and leaders of intelligence agencies, even proven perjurers like James Clapper, on and on. And it seems to me, that we're in the era of happy faith thought control. And I'm not sure what we do to resist that. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, certainly we can turn off the TV. That would be helpful. And look for alternative sources of media like your show. And there are so many good alternative sources of media, and check out media that's coming from other countries as well. I think it's good to see the Russian propaganda. Go on your website and check out RT just to see what the Russians are telling their own people. We need a much more comprehensive look at the world than we're getting from the incredibly sensationalized and monolithic view of the mainstream media. And yes, it has turned the American people into mush, the minds into mush. And the Democrats, I think, history will look very unkindly if we survive this period on what the Democrats have been putting forward, and particularly in this conflict of not looking at not only condemning Russia, but recognizing Russia's legitimate security interests and figuring out how to solve this conflict so that the Ukrainians can have their self-determination, but also how the Russians' legitimate security interests are also dealt with so that there can be peace on the in the European region, and that the U.S. cannot continue to be the arbiter, or trying to be the arbiter, of what the Europeans' relationship is with Russia. And therefore, I think that it's so unfortunate that this episode has strengthened NATO for the short term, but I think in the longer term, there is going to be a lot of division within Europe about how their own security can be guaranteed, and that it must have a level of independence from the United States.
I was talking to a Russian American the other night, and I asked how her sister in Moscow was doing it. She said a lot of people she thought were like-minded, she can't speak with anymore over this issue of militarism and war. I relate to that, but that's why it's so important, the work that you're doing, that you guys are doing on at Code Pink, and it's so important to be speaking out on this issue. I'm so glad you're doing it. So, Medea Benjamin, as always, thanks for your great work, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
And Richard, can I close just by saying if people want to get involved, they can reach us at peaceinukraine.org and join that coalition. Thank you.
Definitely. And thanks again. And we'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.